Okay, well, I am finally back with Catholic Globalism Part 2. It has been a while, but I wanted to finish up a few things, had some things going on, and was involved in a lot of reading and studying. And one of the things that I did was I read this book by Malachi Martin, The Jesuits, which I think was very important to read. From the late Malachi Martin, who was a former Jesuit. So, I want to continue with this talk about Catholic globalism. So let's take a look at a few things. Well, what did Google AI have to say? I put in my comment, digital ID in Britain may become a reality. The Google AI response was, yes, the UK government plans to introduce a digital ID scheme with a mandatory component for verifying a person's right to work, set to be rolled out by August 2029. The free digital ID will be stored on users' phones and is intended to simplify identity checks, access to services, and combat illegal immigration and fraud. So this was December 3rd, 2025. That was the Google AI response I received. Now, talking about globalism. Globalism versus globalization. Globalization is happening. Globalization is happening. It just describes the process of the world, and it is increasing. This interconnectedness of the world, it's happening. And when we think about it, technology plays a big role in globalization. So globalization is going forward. Now, globalism, there has been a pushback toward, or I should say a pushback against globalism. Globalization just describes basically what's happening. It's describing the process. It's happening. The world's becoming more interconnected. That's the reality. Globalism is the ideology and policy that prioritizes global interests over national interests. Now, it may be that there is a pushback against globalism right now that we're seeing. And that pushback, obviously, against globalism is in favor of nationalism. But what I'm interested in is, what does prophecy ultimately point to? And prophecy, as I've said, points away from nationalism toward globalism. Globalization is happening. The components are being put in place to allow that final end-time scenario that, for example, what we read about in the book of Revelation 13, 16, and 17. There is going to be a global, centralized economic attack on the people of God who do not receive the mark of the beast. So when we talk about digital ID, when we talk about that, it is an example of a possibility of what can be useful in bringing about this end-time scenario that the Bible speaks about, digital currency, a global, centralized mechanism that will allow for God's people globally to be persecuted. We know that the mark of the beast is going to be global, and the mark of the beast is Sunday veneration, which ultimately points to the authority of the papacy. That's the mark of the beast. And it's going to be globally enforced. And there is going to be a global persecution of God's people. And the kings of the earth and the merchants of the earth are going to be joined together in this, as, for example, what we see in Revelation 18, verse 3. So the Bible is ultimately pointing away from nationalism toward globalism. And as I've said, when we look at the beast of the earth, which we understand to represent the United States, the beast of the earth basically destroys its constitutional image and recreates itself after the image of the beast of the sea, the papal beast that has a global agenda. And so ultimately, one nation repudiating its constitutional identity in order to recreate itself after the image of another nation to serve a global agenda is not nationalism, And again, I have to say that over and over because it's become so popular within Adventism to speak about Christian nationalism as if that is the ultimate enemy where we've got to watch out for Christian nationalism. And what I'm saying and what I've been saying is that when we read prophecy, we're not talking about Christian nationalism because America is not going to serve its own interests. It's going to serve the global interests of the papacy. The papacy has a global interest, and America is going to repudiate it. It's going to, as we read in Last Day Events, page 131, our country will repudiate every principle of its constitution as a Protestant. So Ellen White is identifying America as a Protestant and Republican government. Okay? So Protestantism and Republicanism, again, 441 of the Great Controversy, she makes it so clear that Republicanism and Protestantism are the secrets of this nation's power. And as I've spoken about in my presentation on the French Revolution and beyond, our system of government, our system of checks and balances, complex, interlocking system of checks and balances, separation of powers, is based on the idea that man has a sinful nature, contrary to Jean-Jacques Rousseau's idea of man being basically good, that was so influential to Maximilien Robespierre, which really lends to the idea of really it's not so necessary to have separation of power between co-equal branches of government. And so therefore, these French leftists, the Jacobins, in common with the modern left, because as I've said, revolutionary France laid down the basis for modern leftism and socialism. And so these Jacobins had embraced this idea of a strong centralized government, centralizing power, not dividing power, centralizing power in a strong government that would enforce equality, that would bring that about and regulate the economy. So this idea of a strong centralized government, okay, as did the French socialists Henry de Saint-Simon, which his idea of a centralized, strong centralized government of technocrats. Okay, now his ideas, obviously, Henry de Saint-Simon didn't become a Jacobin. He was initially favorable of the French Revolution, but the way that these Enlightenment ideas were interpreted in France, the ideas, which in and of themselves, you can see goodness in those ideas of the equality of man, of justice. Then there was fraternity, but also the understanding of the importance of man's reason. And as I've said before, yeah, the Bible is clear. We are all human beings created in the image of God. We're equal in the sight of God as human beings, yes, but we have to see these things through a biblical lens. But the humanistic, the secular, the secularizing, and even the atheistic influence for the French Revolution. Now, obviously, it doesn't mean they were all atheists. The Jacobins weren't all atheists. But the influence of this idea of really elevating man's reason, and Ellen White spoke about that, And the idea of man being basically good, this is contrary to the Bible. Man is not basically good. And so the more skeptical idea of human nature, which was foundational to the system of government that was adopted in America, that had these interlocking checks and balances, it's such an important understanding to have that man is not basically good and that there is a danger in centralizing power. But that idea of Henry de Saint-Simon, of this, who was also not an atheist, but his idea of this centralized system of technocrats to oversee a socialist society. When we think about the direction things are going, and I already pointed out in that presentation of the Bible in the French Revolution that the socialism of Russia from 1917 to 1991, that system doesn't seem to be what prophecy is pointing to. It seems to be pointing of a socialism more like that of China, where we do see those free market elements, but at the same time, there is centralized control over the economy, okay? And socialists in America, people like Mandani, people like Bernie Sanders, who are influenced by Nordic social democracy, their ideas, those ideas, basically, Nordic social democracy was initially influenced by Marxism. But the idea of really getting, so to speak, the best of both worlds. You have the strong centralized government to take care of the people, to enforce equality, to use an idea that is aligned with what the Jacobins wanted, to regulate the economy. And yet at the same time, you have these free market principles. So that seems to be in accord with where things will go globally when we look at prophecy, because as I said, we do have kings of the earth. So we don't have a homogeneous global kingdom. We have kings of the earth. Okay? We have kings of the earth. We have a heterogeneous system. We have kings of the earth. But they're all working together. We have merchants of the earth, but they're ultimately all working together. And so there is a global system, a global governmental system. And so prophecy ultimately points away from nationalism, okay? Because strong nationalism is opposed to globalism. Strong nationalism will lead to an isolationist type of policy within a nation. We're going to look to our own interests. We will not submit our interests or undermine our national interests for the sake of global interests. But remember, the Pope is a global leader religiously, but also the Pope is a temporal leader as well. Because with 1929, with the Lateran Treaty, that was when the papacy regained temporal dominion. But again, I don't want to go into all of that right now. Let's take a look at this video here. Let's take a look at this one. So this is Keir Starmer. Why Keir Starmer's digital ID plans are already collapsing. So there is resistance. There is resistance. Does that mean it's not going to happen? Does that mean the plans were put on hold? No. You see, as the power structures in the world, eventually are brought into that final end time system. That final end time system, there's going to be centralized global power. These kings of the earth and merchants of the earth are going to be working together. The digital ID is not the mark of the beast. Okay, it's not the mark of the beast. Because the mark of the beast is ultimately Sunday veneration. It's dealing with worship. But these are tools. This technology can be used in bringing about that final end time scenario. Now, if there were a global catastrophe or even a national catastrophe of some kind or another pandemic of some kind, something like that could lend a strong hand in causing people to say, hey, you know what, we better get this digital ID. Some kind of disaster could play a part. Or if the government simply says, this is what we're doing, and companies and businesses say, this is what we're doing, you want to stay employed, you've got to do it. And so even though there may be a popular pushback now, that doesn't mean it's going to stop, because when people feel pressure, you see, if people are not converted to the Lord, they're not going to have that courage that God gives them to stand up. And so by nature, it's very easy to choose security and perceived security and safety over liberty. Well, let's take a look at this little video here. Not going to look at the whole thing. Now, I'll put all these links in the description. This one is from TLDR News.
Shortly before the Labour Party conference towards the end of September, Keir Starmer announced plans to introduce a compulsory digital ID system. This resurrection of a Blair-era idea sparked a lot of debate and public and political backlash, with politicians of all stripes distancing themselves from the idea.
So politicians of all stripes distancing themselves from the idea. But as I've said, the process of globalization is continuing. It is increasing. Things are going in one direction. So even if there's popular pushback, that doesn't mean that this plan is going to fall through. And even if it falls through for now, we can see in this possibility, the technology to take part, the technology that can be used as an important way of bringing about that end time scenario.
Signing a petition in opposition and public support for the idea falling in the aftermath of the announcement.
Okay, this is from GBN News.
I spoke to Together campaigner Alan Miller earlier today about digital ID. Here's what he had to say. Now, we know that a lot of you at home are concerned about the concept of digital ID and a big government being able to look into the minutiae of your lives.
Okay, so this idea of big government being able to look in the minutiae of your lives, again, centralization of power. It does relate to a certain degree to Henry de Saint-Simon's idea of technocrats, controlling and overseeing, a centralized government of technocrats overseeing a socialist society. The possibilities that exist now with technology for that happening, for that end time scenario of global control over who can buy and sell. We could see that, as I've said, in this whole digital ID situation and controversy, even if in this instance it doesn't go through, the possibility that technology allows as a tool for bringing about that end time scenario.
The news yesterday that support for digital ID has collapsed. It's gone down from about 35% of the British public to minus 14%. And one man who can take some credit for that nudging of the particular dial is Alan Miller from Together, and he joins me now. Alan, first of all, your reaction to that news that support for digital ID has gone through the floor.
Well, it's fantastic to see the great British public coming out and having their voices heard. It's also very interesting to see that across the political arena, from what they call the left to the centre and the right, there's unanimity in this. The idea that we have a biometric surveillance state constantly censoring, constantly surveying and monitoring the public. The British public do not want this. So it's fantastic to see that. But at the same time,
So the British public don't want this, but as I said, that the potential is there, the technology making that possible. And that's really, I think, what we need to keep in mind, that regardless of what comes out of this particular situation, things are globally going in a certain situation. And so that's ultimately what my focus is. So even though it may be said there's a pushback now against globalism, when we consider globalization as a process is going ahead. And we know from the Bible things are going in a certain direction. This is from Sky News.
What if I told you your phone is about to become your ID, whether you like it or not? Well, it's all part of a controversial government plan to try and discourage illegal migrants.
Let me spell that out. You will not.
So it's interesting that the argument is being presented from the standpoint that may appeal to a British sense of nationalism. You know, this is to discourage illegal migrants. You see, that's how it's being presented. So it's being presented in a way that somebody might say, hey, you know, I like this idea. But the reality is, well, then why wouldn't you strengthen laws of citizenship and crack down on illegal immigration? Why wouldn't you do it that way? So it is interesting because we're going to see, coming from the Gates Foundation, another argument, totally different argument in favor of digital ID.
Be able to work in the United Kingdom if you do not have digital ID. It's as simple as that.
Well, the government says digital ID will be compulsory for everyone in the UK, but you won't actually have to use it, to carry it, or show it to anyone unless you're applying for a job. The ID will be held on your phone, like the NHS app or a bank card, and it'll include your name, date of birth, nationality or residency status, and a photo, and possibly...
So different arguments could be made, ultimately, in support of digital ID. But one way or another, that is a technology that it isn't too hard to see it playing a role in the end time scenario. So I had put this statement to check out what the response would be. I put this statement into Google AI, or into Google to see what Google AI would say. My statement was that Bill Gates favors global digital ID. Google AI with sources provides an overview saying, yes, Bill Gates supports the development of digital IDs as a tool to combat poverty and expand access to essential services. See, so a different type of argument, a different type of push. Through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, he advocates for and funds digital public infrastructure, DPI, which includes secure digital IDs to help people open bank accounts, receive government payments, and access healthcare. He highlights that a lack of formal ID prevents many people from accessing services and that digital IDs can be the solution. And so obviously the response would be, well, that's good. You know, people should have these services. They have these needs. And so this can help combating poverty. Gates views digital IDs as a powerful tool to lift people out of poverty by granting them access to financial services and government programs they would otherwise be excluded from. Digital public infrastructure, DPI. His work supports DPI, a concept that uses digital IDs, mobile payments, and data exchange to connect people to services similar to how roads connect people to goods. So these are digital roads now. Again, thinking again in terms of globalization, digital roads connecting the world. Funding and advocacy. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is a major funder of projects like MOSIP, Modular Open Source Identity Platform, an open source digital ID system. Benefits. Supporters argue that digital IDs can increase economic opportunities, improve access to healthcare, and provide citizens with more control over their data. Yeah, they'll have more control over their data, but who else will have control over their data? Again, thinking in terms of the future. Very interesting. So the Gates Foundation, digital IDs are an effective tool against poverty. So just, again, all these links I'll put in the description here. So here we could see from the Gates Gates Foundation goalkeepers. Gates Foundation digital IDs are an effective tool against poverty. A global situation is making them available to millions. Part 1, our global identity problem. And so I'm not going to read all this. Hear from Ramesh Narayanan. I don't know if I said that name right. Chief Technology Officer, MASIP. And so let's hear what he has to say here.
There is an identity crisis in the world, but that will get solved. But beyond the identity crisis, it's about how people can be part of the digital economy that is getting built in and how they can actually leverage that. Our journey, our hope is to make it easy for people to be part of the digital economy. There are talks of digital divide. We don't want that divide to exist. Our tools will help bridge that divide and make it a seamless experience for any and every person in the world.
So when we think about that digital economy, when we think about these digital global roads of connection, all roads lead to Rome. Wow, isn't that something when you think about that? AMC, Advent Media Connect, had some, I like the way that Pastor James put this little montage together.
If the platforms, whether it's Facebook or Twitter X or Instagram or TikTok, whatever they are, if they don't moderate and monitor the content, we lose total control. And it's not just the social and psychological effects, it's real harm.
What is happening in the UK with...
So dealing with control. We need control over these digital platforms. You know, arguments can be made. Arguments can definitely be made because there are people who interconnect with one another, and sometimes the results of that is not healthy for society. We need some control over who's on these platforms and the information being shared. Well, same thing. Well, these digital IDs, they will be helpful for people to get services. They'll help the world. They'll help bring people out of poverty.
all of digital ID controversy. We are hearing it here from the West. Some of you who watch this channel are from UK. I would like to hear from you.
And that is why today I am announcing this government will make a new free of charge digital ID mandatory for the right to work.
I'm tired. I am sick and tired of fighting these bastards. I don't want to fight. I wasn't put on this planet to fight, but fight we must. Because otherwise they're going to bring in a digital ID, and once that's in a digital currency, we will have total surveillance over everything that we do and we say. It's pretty bad now in the UK for those of you that are watching from another country. There are over 4,000 people in prison at this moment in time for social media posts. Not even their posts, post comments that people...
So again, I keep saying this, but think about Henry de Saint-Simon's idea. Think about this, a centralized government of technocrats. Think about where globalization is heading, and think about that final end scenario. And so these connections can start to be made in your mind. It's not hard to see the direction things are going. They're going in a global direction. Okay, thinking about globalism. The ideology and policy that prioritizes global interests over national interests. Ultimately, we're dealing with the interests of the papacy.
People have made on their posts. This is the time to stand up. This is the hill that we must all die on. This is our freedom that we have to fight for our children and our grandchildren. And all.
Now, as I said, in accordance with our sinful nature, we're more prone to choose security over freedom and liberty. When those threats are felt, because ultimately courage comes from God. And if people are not converted, they will be prone to choosing security.
All of those that come behind us, stand up, everybody. No digital ID. Not on my watch.
First up, digital ID. 4 words you need to learn, and fast. I will not comply. It will be, of course, a centralised point of digital failure. Just look at what's gone on at Land Rover and every British airport, but much more than that. It's a centralised form of control that we do not need. The government said it will make it harder for people to work. Oh my goodness, because that's exactly what Great Britain needs right now, isn't it? We need to make it harder for people to work. I mean, last time I saw some rubber dinghy rapids rocking up on the shoreline with Mohammed, Mahmoud and Omar. They were so desperate to work. I mean, that's the reason they came here, just wanted to work.
So this government trying to bring in digital IDs by the back door, calling it the brick card, trying to make us proud of it. Absolute nonsense.
This is an article by an atheist from The Globalist. Pope Leo XIV, a true American globalist. This is from May 12, 2025. This is an atheist U-bot. And so I just wanted to look at this article. It's interesting. Coming from an atheist. Let's take a look at this. After his election on May 8th, Pope Leo XIV bestowed his first papal blessing, Urbi et Orbi, upon the faithful from the central balcony of St. Peter's Basilica. Urbi et Orbi translates into to the city and to the world. Each papacy is in part defined by the new pope's interpretation of this blessing. Will he be inward looking at the city or outward looking at the world? The first American pope, Pope Leo XIV, certainly is a polyglot. He is, of course, the first American to be elected pope. Leo XIV is also the first pope to hold dual citizenship, and therefore he also is the first Peruvian pope in history. Leo XIV lived for over 20 years in Peru. Finally, it has been disclosed in recent days that Leo XIV has Creole roots on his maternal grandparents' side. It is another interesting aspect of the new pope's life that he received a Bachelor of Science degree in mathematics in 1977 before he made his solemn vows in 1981. This makes Pope Leo XIV a man of science as well as faith. It is likely that all of this made Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost so unique and timely in the eyes of his fellow cardinals during the conclave that they elected him with over 100 votes in the final ballot, far more than the necessary two-thirds majority of 89 votes, according to the Cardinal of Madagascar. Okay, national Urbi versus globalism Orbi. We live in a time where our exponentially advancing technology brings us closer and closer together. Again, the process of globalization. Now, this is coming from the point of view of someone who is favorable of globalism. And yet, the resulting dislocation and disorientation has led many people in more and more countries to choose leaders who appeal to nationalism, Urbi, rather than globalism, Orbi. So again, he is seeing that in a negative sense, this preference for nationalism bad, globalism good, nationalism is evil, globalism is good. At the same time, there is a clash of science and humanity. More jobs are eliminated in advanced countries by progress in technology than by labor migration from foreign lands or by transfer of labor to lower-cost countries. And yet, as workers, blue-collar and white-collar alike, grow ever more anxious about the future, this development has opened the political space to populist demagogues who tout xenophobia and nationalism, all falsely claiming to lift the fortunes of the aggrieved by expelling those from foreign soil and by going it alone. So again, speaking negatively of nationalism. Now, the left tend to be more favorable of globalism than nationalism, while the right tend to favor nationalism. And obviously this presenter, this writer, is a globalist and takes that point of view. The U.S. in denial. Now, as I said, globalism, the Pope is a globalist. Ultimately, the papal beast has a global agenda, not a national agenda. And so those who would see nationalism as a bad thing, we have to keep in mind that strong nationalism is a check against globalism, but ultimately globalism is the direction that the papal beast wants to go, because the papal beast wants global spiritual control. The U.S. in denial, especially in the United States, the denial of science is widespread, from climate change to vaccines, and even to the shape of the earth. As many as 11% of Americans believe the earth is flat. At the same time, there are clearly many Americans who prefer to be inward-looking in a desperate attempt to preserve that which they have long lost, not due to the invasion of foreign labor, but to technology in a post-industrial revolution. Most Americans have therefore chosen a political leader who preaches isolationism rather than integration, stubborn insistence on a return to the past rather than leadership into a more humane future, and sad solitude instead of joyful community, not urbi et orbi, just urbi. In a short while, this political leader has impoverished Americans, not just materially, but in their souls and hearts. And I'm assuming he's obviously talking about Donald Trump. Plutocrats cloaked in a mantle of false promises. Unlike the story of Saint Francis, the man whom Leo the 14th's predecessor, Pope Francis, first Jesuit pope, dedicated his life in papacy, and whose name Pope Leo the 14th holds as his given middle name, modern plutocrats do not dismount their horses to give their expensive cloaks to the poor in an act of compassion. Instead, they ride right past them, cloaked in a mantle of false promises. As an atheist, that's the writer is an atheist, I look with some optimism at the moral leadership Pope Leo the 14th can bring to the table if he so chooses. Cardinal Prevost's choice of following the footsteps of Pope Leo the 13th gives me hope, because it was Pope Leo the 13th who wrote the papal book on social justice. And I've spoken on that a little bit in my presentation on the French Revolution and beyond. And it is a common viewpoint that that term social justice was coined by the Jesuit Luigi Tapparelli. But as I have pointed out, particularly with Jesuit Congregations 31, which ended in 1966, and 32, which ended in 1975, there was really the emphasis, a transformation of the Jesuits, and a great emphasis on social justice, which many renewalist-minded Jesuits at the time, in this spirit of the renewal of Vatican II, had understood to be enacted through socialism. So this idea of socialism and social justice as being embraced by the beast. Now, there may be differences of opinion, and as I've said, there may have been some conflict between the Jesuits and popes, but ultimately the Jesuits are a key force within Catholicism, very influential. And this embracing and this support, particularly from the 1960s onward, of social justice and liberation theology are important to consider when we look at the end time scenario, because the embracing and sanctification of leftist ideology, the embracing of that, and the possibilities that leftist ideology, which points to centralized forms of government, even if in the name of doing good things, because we should care about the poor, we should care about the planet, but ultimately those systems, that is what we can see at work when we look at prophecy, because there's going to be a global centralized system. And so in the name of helping the planet, in the name of helping the poor, in the name, as we're looking at in these examples of helping the poor to have access to healthcare, and all of these things, these digital roads are being created and supported. And so going back to the ideas of Henry de Saint-Simon, technocrats playing such a vital role in his idea of what the ideal society would be, well, those ideas are common to what we see the end time scenario pointing to, where there will be global control over who can buy and sell. So again, we're seeing this article, and so I'll just go a little further down here. And so, as a polyglot, and yes, a globalist, Pope Leo the 14th embraces not just confined urbi, that is Rome, but the world. Again, you can see that article. I will put that in there. I will put that in there. The globalist Pope. And again, when we think about the institution, this I thought was also interesting. And so I'll close with this from the Council of Foreign Relations. Council of Foreign Relations. Again, have the link there. The power of the Pope. So what we're going to see here, and keep this in mind, we're in the time of the iron mixed with clay. We're in the toes of time. We're in the feet of the statue of Daniel chapter 2. We're in the time of the iron mixed with clay. That iron is the Roman iron. It is that Roman iron that seeks to hold things together. And so papal Rome is playing such a vital role in this end time world to bring the world together into this final state, which ultimately will result in the persecution of God's people, where the kings of the earth and the merchants of the earth all join together in support of the beast. See, because partly strong and partly brittle. So we have that iron, but we have the clay, we have the miry clay, the brittle, but we have the strong part of the iron, which we understand that's Rome. This is papal Rome. This is papal Rome globally working to pull things together. So that's why I am saying clearly that prophecy is not pointing to nationalism. It is pointing to Catholic globalism. It is not pointing ultimately to Christian nationalism. It is ultimately pointing to Catholic globalism. Can Christian nationalists open the door to that final scenario? Yes, they can. But so can progressive Christians who embrace policies more in line with Pope Francis, more in line with Pope Prevost, more in line with those progressive Jesuits. So let's hear this out, some of this.
You know you've made it to the highest level of prestige when you get to meet the Pope. Actors, artists, athletes, and politicians, they all clamor for a handshake with His Holiness. But aside from his star power, the Pope also has a lot of actual power. He runs a massive organization that serves over 1.3 billion Catholics worldwide, nearly a fifth of the global population. On any given issue, you may find the Church's position agreeable or egregious. What you may not realize, though, is that for some 2,000 years, the Pope has been at the center of global affairs.
Now, I'm not going to play this whole thing, but I'm just going to get to some key parts.
Has a seat at the table alongside heads of state and is sought after for his distinct form of influence and diplomacy. I'm Gabrielle Sierra, and this is Why It Matters. Today, the Pope's one-of-a-kind role in international relations. This is Timothy Burns. He's a professor of political science at Colgate University. He's also the author of 4 books about the Catholic Church's role in politics and global affairs.
So this professor, Timothy Burns, is going to speak about the power of the Pope politically, globally.
He's this major sort of religious figure leading the largest single religious institution in the world. That's one reason. But he's also the leader of the Catholic hierarchy throughout the world. And by that, I mean every bishop in the world is appointed by the Pope personally. And he is the leader of each national hierarchy or conference. So when you think about world politics or international relations, whatever country is interacting with another country, there are Catholics in those countries, and they are led by bishops who are appointed by and led by the Pope. He's involved with all of these national hierarchies all over the world. And then finally, and really kind of oddly, to be honest with you, he's a formal participant in diplomatic relations. The Pope, the Holy See, at the moment has diplomatic relations with 183 countries, including the United States, for example. So he has access to international relations in a way that no other religious leader could even imagine having. Right. He's a permanent observer at the United Nations. He's invited as a formal participant in UN conferences and conventions.
Did you get that? Relations with 183 countries. For perspective, that's more than the US, and the US does a lot of diplomacy.
So the network of the papacy, the political global network of the papacy, is beyond that of the US, with these relations, with diplomatic relations with 183 countries. So again, the Pope obviously is a global political leader, and when you think of that iron mixed with clay, it's the iron, that Roman iron, that is pulling things together, that is holding things together in a sense. And so the papal system is working globally to bring the beast system is working globally to bring the world back under, or to bring the world under its control.
And this gets at the crux of it. The Pope's role on the world stage is not just symbolic or religious. He's involved in negotiations and diplomacy on a daily basis.
Can you tell me a little bit about the structure of the Vatican's foreign policy arm? Do they have a State Department?
They do. There's a person who's called the Vatican Secretary of State, interestingly enough. There's two people below him. One runs the kind of internal church matters. And the other, well, the Undersecretary for Relations with States, he runs, they're all he, of course, runs relations with states. So yes, it's a kind of a State Department. And they have country desks, they have regional leaders, just like any State Department would in a country. And then they have these ambassadors, they're called nuncios or apostolic delegates, but mostly nuncios. And those are sent to these countries with which the Vatican has diplomatic relations. And then interestingly enough, the countries with whom the Holy See has diplomatic relations, there are ambassadors from those countries in Rome. So like the United States has an ambassador who lives in Rome and who interacts with the Holy See and the Pope pretty much as any other diplomat would. So he has this really unique place in the world. He leads this huge religious institution, which brings with it an enormous amount. I'm interested, you mentioned Kardashians, the sort of celebrity focus of this global religious figure. He heads the hierarchies in all countries around the world as they interact with politics and international relations. And then he's a diplomatic legal player in international relations and UN processes.
Is the Pope the only religious leader welcomed into these discussions?
Formally, yes. I mean, you don't have diplomatic relations with Islam or Orthodoxy or Judaism or any other religion. So in formal terms, for sure, he is. But there are other religious leaders. We can think about Islamic leaders.
So when you think of the papal system as this unique political system, all right, you have Vatican City, it's its own country, it's its own political entity. The Pope is the monarch. He's the sole ruler. He is the sovereign over Vatican City. He is a political leader. So this is a unique kingdom when you think of that little horn type imagery of Daniel chapter 7, where this horn is different from the other horns. It's a very unique kind of kingdom with global influence, global diplomatic influence.
In Iran, for example, who are certainly players in international relations, largely through their leadership at an individual state. And so those religious leaders do have a certain political role to play. But in terms of transnational global religious leaders, no, I'm waiting for someone to come along who can mention anyone who's even in the same category.
Before we go any further...
So as far as transnational global religious leaders, there's no religious leader on par with the Pope. No religious leader on par with the Pope. And that's a fact. And the Bible points to it. This is the little horn power. This is this unique global political and religious power.
Further, there are 3 phrases we're using in this episode: the Pope, the Holy See, and the Vatican. They refer to different things, but they often get used interchangeably. You can think about it sort of like the president, the executive branch, and the White House. One is a person, one is an organization, and one is a place. The Pope is the person in charge. The Holy See is the organization he's in charge of, and the Vatican, or Vatican City, is the place where that organization is located.
The Vatican is the headquarters of the International Catholic Church in Rome. So it comprises St. Peter's, it comprises a bunch of other buildings that are used administratively, residentially. Vatican City is about a 100-acre microstate, which was ceded to the Church and the Holy See in the 1920s as part of the Lateran Accord. So Vatican City, if anyone's ever been there as a tourist, that's when you walk into St. Peter's Square and you're no longer in Italy. The Vatican are those buildings that house the international headquarters of the Catholic Church.
So it's its own country to itself?
It is.
Because I went as a kid, I don't remember doing a passport thing.
No.
So once again, it's its own country. Okay, Vatican City, it's its own country. And the Pope is the leader. The Pope is the leader of that country. And as she put it, the Holy See is the organization. So this nation, this political entity, the United States, will basically recreate itself. It will create the image of the beast. Babylon is fallen. And so the apostate Protestant churches are coming back in line with Catholicism.
The Pope is the Bishop of Rome, actually. He's elected by the College of Cardinals to serve as the Bishop of Rome. And as Bishop of Rome, he also serves as what's called the Supreme Pontiff of the Catholic Church. So he is, in a sense, the head bishop of all Catholics throughout the world.
And the president or king of the Vatican in that sense then?
Well, again, I would say Vatican City. He is the absolute ruler. They don't use the word king, or certainly not president, but he is in fact legally the absolute ruler of the microstate of Vatican City.
So the Pope has a unique combination of institutional, diplomatic, and soft power. But what does this look like in reality? Well, a lot of it is happening every day behind the scenes. But every once in
a lot of it is happening every day behind the scenes. Okay? That iron mixed with clay. It's the iron that's pulling things together, holding things together, moving things together behind the scenes. When you think about it, that iron is the strong part in that mixture of iron and clay. Partly strong, partly brittle. It's the iron that's the strong part. It's the Roman iron that is reaching throughout the world and networking. And as I said, we were talking about those digital roads, and all roads lead to Rome. So you think of that iron going throughout the world, and the Pope, political diplomats, the nuncios that were mentioned, going throughout the world, working throughout the world, the Jesuits, and the papal influence. Now, we're going to hear a very interesting, and that's what I'm going to close with here, a very interesting example of that.
a while, these interactions make history.
When Julian Assange released WikiLeaks, one of the things that was released that drew my attention, but maybe not yours, was that there were a huge number of documents within the United States State Department which reflected the communications between the U.S. State Department and the Holy See. And they were fascinating. You know, this was under President George W. Bush and Obama mostly. The U.S. diplomatic leaders acknowledged and recognized that the Holy See was a unique actor in international relations. Because it wasn't just the state. And so you read cables and documents from State Department leaders in the Obama administration, for example, saying, like I would, you know, there's nobody else like this. These people are kind of diplomatic representatives of a global institution. And we can work with them on all kinds of issues, having to do with Middle Eastern politics, having to do with climate change, having to do with diplomatic relations with Cuba, which is a fascinating story I'd like to tell.
I'd love to hear that story.
So, as I'm sure you know, the United States broke off diplomatic relations with Cuba after the Castro Revolution. The United States imposed an economic embargo on Cuba for decades. And so the United States and Cuba not only didn't have diplomatic relations, they almost didn't talk to each other at all. It was like a basic fact of American electoral college dynamics that you just couldn't even talk about relations with Cuba. Obama was interested in reaching out to Cuba. This was just something he thought would be a kind of historic step that he could take. But he knew that he couldn't do it himself. And so what he did was he contacted prominent Catholic bishops in the U.S. who, remember, are not only American citizens, they're also bishops of the Catholic Church who are in communion with the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, and have these kind of relationships with other bishops around the world. And so Catholic bishops in the US and Catholic bishops in Cuba began to communicate to each other through diplomatic pouches sent from the Holy See and the Vatican to the US State Department in the United States.
Whoa.
So the Vatican or the Holy See served as a kind of a honest broker with full secrecy and discretion between the Cuban government and the United States government as mediated by Cuban bishops and American bishops.
Huh.
And then one day, Barack Obama called a press conference and said,
"Good afternoon. Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba in the most significant changes in our policy in more than 50 years. We will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead, we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries."
And that was done through the church.
The Vatican had contacts on both sides, in part because there were large Catholic communities on both sides. And they used that trust to open a door that had been closed for decades. Now, we should mention that the Trump administration undid this diplomatic progress with Cuba a few years later. But that's another story.
So, when it came to that diplomatic progress with Obama and Cuba, he had to go through the Catholic Church, through those Catholic bishops to make that happen. So it's just a very, very powerful illustration of the power of the Pope. Okay, we're talking about Catholic globalism and the political movements that are happening behind the scenes. So, thinking about globalization and thinking about the papacy as an institution with global political influence, ultimately the world is and then when we think about technology, we can really see that end time scenario coming together, and it is a global scenario. Well, God bless you.